Well, we made it through the worst parts of that debate where things got a little bit too heated right there in the first half towards the middle. And then towards the end, when Flint starts talking about ancient agriculture, it starts to really calm down. And then it gets to a point where the elephant in the room is finally brought up by Rogan when he says, he just cuts Flint off and says, I want to get to ancient Egypt, which it's amazing that it took 3.5 hours just for us to touch on what is basically the elephant in the room in this ancient lost civilization conversation, which are the megalithic, extremely inexplicable achievements achieved by the ancient Egyptians, or perhaps a pre-pharaonic civilization, as some ancient civilization theorists suggest, including Hancock over the last 30 years, although he's kind of backpedaled a little bit on some of the things that he said. But we'll get to that. So this entire second part review is going to be pretty much just addressing what the debate pertained to as far as ancient Egypt. So they each kind of give their own presentation, and Graham really takes this segment and conversation by the horns and kind of leads this whole next hour. But that makes sense because after watching it, you can really see that Graham is really, really well read on ancient Egypt, where Flint, maybe not so much, but we're going to get to that. So Graham gives his presentation that he says at the very least, the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau, as well as the Sphinx Temple, as well as the foundational primordial mounds in which the Great Pyramids are built on top of, are all at least 7,000 to 12,000 years old, according to the examination and the work done by Robert Schoch, who is a geologist that went there in the 90s, I think 95 or 96, with John Anthony West. And even in his book, he says that within 90 seconds of viewing the Sphinx, he immediately knew that it was older than 4,500 years old. And initially, he said, well, a conservative estimate would, he pushed it back another 3,000 years, back to 7,000 years ago, which would be 4,000 BC. But since then, he's pushed it another 4,000 to 5,000 years, making it arguably around 10,000 to 11,000 years old, maybe even 12,000 years old. And so Graham's theory is essentially that there are the ruins or the remnants that are renovated on the Giza Plateau. And he shows photos of the Sphinx Temple. The inner walls are these dilapidated, very extremely eroded limestone megalithic blocks that have granite casing stones laid over them, where the granite is cut to be symmetrical or to line up perfectly with the eroded limestone rock, which is kind of inexplicable other than the fact that those blocks must have been there being exposed to rainfall for so long that they look the way that they do. And the Egyptians came later on to repair this temple, and they built the granite stone. So one side is flat and the other side lines up perfectly with the erosional patterns of the limestone blocks. That's the only way I can think to explain this. And I'm a pretty conservative person. I don't really jump to insane conclusions, but gosh, I mean, what other way do you describe it other than that? If the dynastic Egyptians laid both of these, if they had the ability to quarry and perfectly cut granite blocks flat on one side, so symmetrical that you can hardly stick a card between the granite blocks, and then on the other side they're able to carve the granite block where it lines up with an already eroded limestone block, they could have just got a giant perfect limestone block anyways, like they do all over the Giza Plateau and even potentially down at the Osirion. So that's a mystery there. That was very convincing. That photo that he showed, that was, I've seen it before, but seeing it again, it made me reconsider the reality that, yeah, on the Giza Plateau, there are definitely restorations there of even more ancient structures. I'm not sure that these are 12,000 years old. I'm not sure if they're maybe 7,000 or 8,000 years old. It's hard to say. But the reason that Graham takes, so if I were looking at this, my initial thought might be, okay, the dynastic Egyptians are repairing something that was pre-dynastic. So maybe something that was built in 4,000 BC. Maybe the Sphinx is from 4,000 BC. Slightly more rainfall there. Egypt is slightly more green, but it's rapidly becoming an arid desert. That would be my first idea. Maybe even push it back to 5,000 BC, or hell, you know, maybe there was an advanced civilization or extremely developed civilization there up to 8,000, 9,000 BC, right before the Sahara begins becoming much more dry. The reason that Graham pushes it up to the Younger Dryas period is because when you look at the Sphinx, and he believes that it's pretty obvious that the Sphinx is a celestially aligned monument. And so when the Sphinx is looking east in 12,500 years ago, it is directly facing the constellation of Leo during the age of Leo. It's an entire epoch or an era of the age of Leo where Leo is housing the sun. And I think that that's a pretty good theory. I mean, you look at the constellation of Leo, and then you look at the form and the shape of the Sphinx, they're eerily similar to each other. Now, Flint's rebuttal to this is, well, it sounds like a good theory, but that's not really how archaeology works. We can't 100% accept that and then start writing it in textbooks. It would be a one-off. It would be the first and only time that he's ever seen something like this in the ancient world. At least it's a one-off in the ancient world of Egypt. You do see these similar things in, let's say, the Maya world, or even at Angkor Wat, like Graham shows right before he gets to talking about the Sphinx. But Flint says that it would be a one-off in ancient Egypt, which I suppose is a good rebuttal, but at the same time, I really do find the concept of the Sphinx being older than dynastic Egypt really extremely convincing. Another thing about that is when you look in the Sphinx pit, which they touch on, and Flint, for some reason, he just doesn't budge that the Sphinx pit looks really eroded by water. It's very unambiguously water erosion. And so many other geologists have agreed when they didn't realize what they were looking at. Schock took these photos and he sent them to other geologists and didn't tell them what it was, or maybe he even misled them into thinking it was something else, and they respond back and they say, oh, well, that's for sure thousands of years, at least 1,000 years of water erosion. Then he turns around and he says, well, hey, this is actually the Sphinx pit. So if you're saying that, you're telling me that this Sphinx pit is much older than the time, the height of the Old Kingdom, during the time of Khafre, which they attribute the Sphinx to. Touching on that again, there are these old inscriptions. It's some of the only inscriptions that very loosely connect themselves to the king Khafre, but it's the only inscriptions that are inside the Sphinx temple. So it's very loose evidence that they use to tie the Sphinx and the Sphinx temple to Khafre. So it's a tough argument, and I don't think that Flint 100% unequivocally proved Graham wrong. I don't think he proved Graham wrong at all, really. He does argue that there are other geologists who don't agree with Robert Schock, which I'm sure that there are, but how many of these geologists do we know are being 100% honest with themselves, let alone an audience that would love to hear their true, honest thoughts on this matter, because they're scared of the consequence and the retaliation of their own peers? I mean, academics don't have the best record of being very kind to one another, let alone somebody that differs from the normal train of thought. Then Flint starts to talk about the different levels of stratigraphy in the striations that are in the limestone of the Sphinx, and how that might disprove the water erosion theory. But with some of the things pertaining to ancient Egypt, I think that Rogan and Graham have a good understanding of what they're talking about with each other, but I think that Flint does not have a good grasp on what ancient civilization theorists are talking about when it comes to ancient Egypt. One case in particular, and this is not to derail from the Sphinx, although I'll try to come back to the Sphinx. One case in particular is when they're talking about, Rogan is like, how do you explain the Egyptians coring granite? So, you know, they're drilling a circular hole, not a cylindrical hole, but a circular hole into granite and pulling out a core piece, which means that they're coring the outline of a cylinder and then pulling a cylinder out. It's not a coned drill that they're drilling into the granite and there's just a hole with bits of dust left. What Joe was talking about was coring. And he said that several times to Flint, but I don't think Flint was realizing, and Flint may not even realize, that there are granite cores that come from ancient Egypt. Not just a drill hole, but an actual core. And Joe keeps saying, okay, no, but they're coring it. But they're coring it. How do they do that? And Flint says, well, they would have done it with a copper chisel, sand, and water. And he's like, well, how do you do it? And he says, well, you just keep grinding and drilling into it by hand, and it's the sand, it's the abrasion of the sand. But just by the way that Flint was explaining it, I could tell that he didn't realize that Joe is literally talking about not drilling a drill hole, about coring, pulling a core out, a cylindrical core out of a block of granite. I don't think Flint even realized that those existed, and that's a huge mystery. That's a huge elephant in the room. And there were some other things like that that never even came up in the debate. I, for one, was really surprised that Graham never brought up the vases. And I know the guys who work on the vases. Matt Bell, who's a good friend of mine, owns a plethora of vases. He owns one of the OG original vases. I don't know that Matt Bell and Graham have ever touched base. I'm sure it's going to happen in the future, but I was really surprised that the vases, which are one of the largest mysteries in ancient Egypt. I mean, how did the pre-dynastic people construct some of the most complex and solid vases where the interior of the vase is symmetrical and parallel with the exterior, and it's some of the hardest materials on the entire planet? How did pre-dynastic civilizations do that without the evidence of the lathe, at least the lathe? I was surprised that that never really came up, and I got the sense there was a lot that Graham wanted to touch on that he didn't get to touch on, and maybe that's that explanation. And they left it the final hour of the debate for Egypt, which, man, I would have thought that at least half of the debate could have been surrounded on Egypt instead of the mysteries of Mesoamerica and the Olmecs and ancient agriculture and lost civilizations in the Amazon and lost civilizations in the Sahara. Those are all interesting, but I think that they could be limited to half, and I think you could easily spend the next half of the debate talking about ancient Egypt, because that's really one of the cornerstones of this lost civilization, lost technology argument. So yeah, I got the sense that Flint was a little bit underread for ancient Egypt, and that they didn't really have enough time to get into everything that Graham wanted to get into. Another reason I think Flint was underread was that he pulled up this mural. It's a New Kingdom mural of about 60 servants or 60 workers pulling a massive sitting megalithic statue. While I call it massive and megalithic, it is very small compared to other statues that were moved in ancient Egypt. And they essentially say that they would pour water and oil in front of the sled, and that it would help with the friction of pulling the statue across the sand. Nobody's arguing that. And I think that the statue in question is about 65 tons. But they were pulling massive obelisks and statues and stones that weigh anywhere from 80 to several hundred tons, even upwards of 1,000 or more tons. They're moving statues that are incomprehensibly more massive and heavy than the statue being shown in this mural that Flint shows. And I could tell by the way that he brought it up on the screen that he thought that maybe it was something that Graham and Rogan hadn't seen before. But that same mural has been shown on Joe Rogan's podcast before, during podcast when Graham is on. And a lot of ancient civilization theorists have addressed that specific New Kingdom mural. So it's not a definitive refutation that maybe Flint was hoping that it would be. And so, I don't really necessarily fault Flint for this. It just shows that he's not in touch with what the ancient civilizations community, how well read they all are, how well read the audience is. I think he maybe thinks that they might be more ignorant than they actually are. But if you go watch all of Graham's interviews, or you thoroughly read his books, he really covers a lot. And it's not just him. I mean, I think that a good follow-up to that, especially somebody who specializes in ancient Egypt, would be Ben from Uncharted X. The mysteries of ancient Egypt and the accomplishments and the feats of those people that he highlights in his videos, those stand true, and many of them are still unexplainable today. And I think that Flint could have benefited from tapping into, because at the end he really highlights all of these other more orthodox mainstream archaeological channels. And while he was doing that, I think he maybe should have taken the time to dive into channels like Uncharted X, or like some of the videos and podcasts and conversations that the Snake Bros have had. And I think he would have gotten a better sense of how to address Graham as well as the greater topic as a whole. But it felt like he didn't really realize how well read this community really is. Him showing that mural was nothing new to people kind of on this side of the aisle. So it was a little disappointing that they didn't touch on so much more of ancient Egypt, because it really is the most amazing culture and civilization that we know has existed. And it's really the centerpiece of this whole ancient lost civilization, lost technology argument. So bringing it back to the Sphinx and the pyramids and the Giza Plateau as a whole, Flint then begins to give a presentation as to why the Great Sphinx is attributed to the king Khafre, who's attributed to the middle pyramid on the Giza Plateau. And he says that the reason is simply because of radiocarbon dating. So they've taken fragments of wood that were found inside of the pyramids. They date those to be about 4,500 years old, and then they date the surrounding sites according to that. So it's maybe it's an okay conservative good Egyptological argument, but it's anything but airtight, and I didn't think that it refuted what Graham was saying at all. Furthermore, kind of adding to the idea that I thought that maybe Flint wasn't super well read on Egypt was that I'm not sure that those planks of wood that he was talking about were found in either of the three Great Pyramids, but instead in the bent pyramid, where you have these ceiling pieces, planks of wood that are in the ceiling, possibly to help with stability. Those are cedars of Lebanon that supposedly Senefru had commissioned out of the Mediterranean and down into the deserts of Dashur. So he's kind of using things that were found in the bent pyramid to date the pyramids of Giza, to date the Sphinx, and then to establish a correlation between the Sphinx and the pharaoh that the Sphinx was built in honor of. That's a loose argument. That's essentially what I got from the podcast. That's a loose argument. It's not airtight. I understand it because we're talking about such remote history. If you're a very, very conservative archaeologist and you want to try to be as accurate as possible, I totally understand that argument, and I totally understand saying, hey, as far as what we're going to print in a textbook, we just can't go beyond this because this is all the evidence that we have. But to then take it a step further and to tell anybody who is theorizing different conclusions about this same mystery or about these same pieces of evidence, to then respond to that person and double down and irrefutably say that no, we have 100% concrete evidence that these are not as old as you say. I think that that's taking it a step way too far, actually. Not just a little bit too far, it's way too far. I felt that's kind of what was happening here. Maybe no fault to Flint on his own, but I think that probably this conversation, he's going to reflect on it and become a lot more, hopefully he's going to become a lot more open-minded and not so quick to shut down other people theorizing about these things that are already in such remote history. I mean, I don't think people realize it. I know this is said all the time, but think about how disconnected you are from Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. Okay, that was 2,000 years ago. The pyramids from that point, how we feel that Cleopatra is 2,000 years ago, it's so insanely disconnected from our world. Cleopatra was further away from the pyramids than we are from her. The time of 2500 BC, 4,500 years ago, the height of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, is so ridiculously deeply far back into the remote past that we hardly know anything at all. On top of that, it's so far in the past that even Moses from the Bible, who would have lived around 1250 BC, so that's about 1200 to 1300 years after the supposed date of the construction of the pyramids, we hardly have any evidence that he even existed. We barely even know anybody who existed during that time, aside from some of the most very, very important people in the middle to the Near East of that time. We can't even definitively prove that the Israelites had an exodus from Egypt at this time. So the pyramids are that far back in a remote history. I don't think that you can vehemently say with 100% confidence and shoot somebody else down that we know exactly when the pyramids were created, especially when all of that sits on the carbon dating of a few planks of wood. And then Rogan rebuttals this and he says, okay, well, if the pyramids were 12,000 years old and another civilization comes along and finds them, wouldn't they renovate it and kind of upkeep it? And could that be where the wood comes from? The dynastic Egyptians, eventually they come from a group of people who find the pyramids and they settle around the pyramids and they go in and renovate it and try to upkeep it, which I understand that argument. The problem with that is look at the erosion on the Sphinx temple. Look at the limestone erosion on the Sphinx temple. Look at the limestone erosion inside the Sphinx pit and compare that erosion to the limestone blocks that are on the Great Pyramids. You don't see that kind of erosion on the limestone blocks of the Great Pyramids. You would see these flowing striations of water that's constantly raining on the pyramids because the Sahara doesn't begin to get dry until about 7,000 to 6,000 to 5,000 BC. So you would have had, if they were built 12,000 years ago, you would have had 3,000 or 4,000 years at least that it would have been getting semi-regular rainfall. So those pyramids would have been torn up. You would see the remnants of, I mean, they were covered in granite casing stones, but you would see the remnants of water seeping down into the pyramid somewhere, but we just don't see that. And that's not even, if you look at the Sphinx temple and you look at how the Egyptians are cutting these blocks to encase the Sphinx temple, it's possible that they could have turned around. I guess theoretically it's possible that they could have also done that to the pyramids if the pyramids were very old. But you would see that erosion on the limestone that would have been covered up by the granite blocks. And you just don't see that. It's two vastly different types of erosion on the Sphinx complex to the pyramids. And to that effect, Graham very much, he clarifies, which is kind of groundbreaking, because I think that for a long time he was championing the idea that the Great Pyramids could be 12,000 years old. But he does say, you know, I'm not advocating for the possibility that the pyramids are 12,000 years old. I'm advocating for the possibility that the Sphinx complex, the Sphinx temple, as well as the primordial mounds, the foundations that the pyramids sit on, those might be 12,000 years old. And he goes even further. He says that the chambers inside of the Great Pyramid lead to shafts that point out into the dynastic Egyptian night sky at constellations that align with dynastic Egyptian mythology. So the pyramids, in a way, they align themselves to dynastic Egypt if you understand dynastic mythology, which Graham, I mean, he prefaces that. He says that to understand the date of the pyramids, you have to understand Egyptian mythology, and that those shafts that point up to Egyptian constellations in the night sky, it's kind of unequivocal proof that I mean, these are dynastic structures. I really agree with Graham here. I may not jump to the idea that the Sphinx and the Sphinx temple are 12,000 years old, but the more I think about it, the more I think about these stories of a land before Egypt and these very ancient godlike mythological kings that existed thousands of years before dynastic Egypt, perhaps that's calling on some memory of what they call Zep-Tepi. And perhaps there were these pre-pharaonic large civilizations in Upper and Lower Egypt that are responsible for the original carving of the Sphinx. Maybe it really was a lion, or maybe it was a Sphinx with a human head all along, but I think that certainly the head has been recarved at some point, whether it was from one human head to another human head, or whether it was originally a lion cut down to a human. Lion seems fitting to me, but it's just almost impossible to say. But yes, I do agree. I think that the evidence, like Graham says, points towards the pyramids being dynastic feats, which is, I think a lot of people were surprised that Graham said that, but I think that at this point there's sufficient evidence that it's not as old as the Sphinx complex. I agree that the Sphinx complex is probably older than dynastic Egypt. I think it's pretty obvious. So then Rogan kind of presses Flint and he says, how are people able to do this? I mean, it's almost inconceivable, all these achievements that he says, regardless of timeline, all these ancient feats that we see in Egypt, it's mind-blowing that this was even possible, that it could be done. And Flint's like, well, these are smart people, man. And he's like, and Rogan pushes back and he goes, no, they're kind of beyond smart, which I agree with. And Rogan didn't really delve into that, but it's almost like he was referring to that they were privy to some kind of knowledge that was coming from, let's say, the outer world. And I've been having similar ideas traveling around in Mesoamerica, but I won't get into that right now. But Flint kind of brushed off that idea that they may have been privy to some kind of knowledge that we're just completely disconnected to, while at the same time Flint does say, well, you know, one thing, Joe, is that these ancient people, they didn't have TV, they didn't have the Joe Rogan podcast to watch, they had the night sky. And I think that that's so true. I was having a conversation with my wife the other day. We were sitting outside looking up at the stars, and I was thinking, you know, when's the last time you did this? It's probably been a long time. But ancient people, try to put yourself in their shoes. They would have looked up at this every night and pondered the world around them, and they would have in some ways realized their insignificance, or they would have realized some kind of purpose. They would have been certainly privy to thoughts that we are totally unaware of today. I just find it strange that Flint brought that up while still kind of discounting the really incredible knowledge that it's beyond incredible. I mean, what they're able to do is mind-blowing, and in so many ways it's inexplicable. I have experienced this before. I experienced it in school. I experienced it in the field with other expert archaeologists who they kind of grin and smirk at the idea of ancient cultures being privy to knowledge that comes from the outer world, which is so woo-woo of me to say. There's something to that. I mean, you see that the origins of a lot of ancient civilizations come from shamanism. And you see the benefits of natural psychedelic plants and what they do for people. I mean, even Nikola Tesla said that he felt like his brain was a radio that was receiving thoughts and ideas and premonitions from out in the ether. And while that's something that I don't know if it's testable right now, I don't think that it should be so brushed off. Look at how much ancient cultures are based in mythology. Look at how many ancient cultures attribute their feats to their gods. And look how many ancient cultures say that all of their knowledge that they got was from their gods. And look at how many ancient cultures idealize all of their psychedelic plants. In ancient Egypt, you see it all over the murals. In Mesoamerica, you see it all over the murals. In South America, you see it all over the murals. I don't know. That was kind of brushed over. Access to mind-altering plants is something that all ancient cultures had in common, and that is brushed over. And I find that especially strange for Flint as somebody who studies ancient agriculture, that the idea of global use of psychedelics creating similarities across the ancient world was never mentioned. I think that's a huge key to this argument that's being left out. All in all, the second half of this conversation was much more amicable than the first. There weren't any little petty shots at each other. I think when it came to Egypt, I think that Graham kind of had the upper hand here, and I think that Graham didn't even get into everything he wanted to get into because he kept pressing throughout the debate. He was like, we don't have time for this. We need to move on. We need to move on. And I could kind of tell at the end, he was a little bit discontented with the fact that, and I think he even says it. He says, I did not, and Flint, I'm sure you did not address everything that you came here to address, because there really is so much to address. I think people on the outside, perhaps the audience is watching, don't quite realize just how much the plethora of information there is to discuss and how nuanced everything is. And so I could tell he was a little bit discontented with the fact that he didn't get to touch on everything that he wanted to. But I think that when it came to Egypt, Graham kind of came out of it looking pretty strong. And at the very least, making it very obvious that there are many things in ancient Egypt that are still totally unexplained. And I think that Flint kind of showed that when it comes to ancient Egypt, he just wasn't as well read as Graham. And I think that he didn't have the best grasp on what the community as a whole is interested in and how much the community as a whole actually knows. I think he maybe thinks that they're more uneducated than they really are. All in all, the second half, the latter half talking about ancient Egypt was good. I think that the finale, the conclusion where they both said that, hey, we need to start coming together. Everything that happened in this podcast, let's put it behind us. Let's not address it anymore. And let's move forward and bring the temperature down. And if we're going to bring the temperature down, we need to reevaluate how we speak to each other. And I agree with that. I mean, it all starts with speaking kindly to one another and recognizing that the people on the other side of the intellectual aisle are also humans, and not treating them like they're these monolithic characters that aren't real. Because Graham made it very obvious that he was really hurt by a lot of these accusations. And I think that sort of clouded what could have been a much more data and evidence-based debate. But at the same time, Graham was debating somebody who maybe didn't outright explicitly say that Graham was a white supremacist or a racist, but also perhaps at a certain point in time before he had ever met Graham, when he was still, an obscure, lesser-known person, he didn't really have a problem with painting Graham with a broad brush that may have painted Graham in a light that is inaccurate. So it's tough for Graham to stay super evidence and data based when he's sitting here debating somebody who was a part of painting him in a light as a racist white supremacist that's just completely unfounded. It's not true. Graham, while he has always been a proponent of this ancient lost global civilization, he has never theorized what their skin color would be ever. And I just don't think that any of Graham's theories are coming from a racially inclined point of view. I mean, he's had 30 years to get to it. If he was going to say that they were a specific skin color, he would have gotten to it by now. But Graham obviously is not a racially biased person, and any accusations calling him a racist are unfounded and completely dishonest. Now, with all this said, I think they're both decent people. Everybody that I know that personally knows these people and the interactions that I have had with both of them have all been positive. All in all, I give Flint the props for being the only academic with the guts to be able to step forward and go on this huge platform where he's going to get so much backlash for taking on Graham Hancock. I give him a lot of accolades for being the only guy to have the guts to step up and do it. I think that he presented a lot of good ideas that personally make me question things. However, I think at the end of the day, he did not totally refute the idea of there being an ancient lost civilization. And I think that Graham had a lot of great points as to just how much there is left to discover in the ancient world, and how we can't really definitively say that there was no global ancient lost civilization, let alone academics in a position of power and leverage to be able to ridicule people. I think that Graham did an excellent job in showing that there's a lot left to be discovered. And all in all, I think that they really kind of went punch for punch and tit for tat all the way up until you get to Egypt, and it was obvious that Flint just wasn't as well read as Graham. So I don't know who won. And it doesn't really matter to me, because I think that it was a great conversation, and I hope that it is a paradigm shift in how people on both sides, on both schools of thought, interact with each other. And I hope that this is the first of many more debates, because as people are debating, I see very influential people on both sides of the aisle bicker at each other on Twitter all the time, and they launch these massive videos attacking and belittling people on the other side. If they were to meet in person and have a debate, it would completely change the atmosphere and the tone. But you've got people who are profiting off of controversy, who are profiting off of putting these negative connotations on everything and making it all feel really hot and controversial, right? So we'll see if this positively affects anything. But for me, I loved the debate. I thought it was a great step in the right direction, and by the end of it, I was so glad that they were able to shake hands and both agreed that the temperature in the room needs to come down, and that we all need to treat each other much more kindly and work more amicably with each other. And there's so many ways. Flint brings up something that's pretty sad, that at Cardiff University and all these other universities, the aspects of the archaeological department are being threatened of being defunded. And he's, telling people to donate to these different funds. And one thing that I would hope someday that these academics would realize is that the people in these ancient Civ theorist communities would be able to pull in the funding that could help save some of these aspects of archaeology and save some of these departments of archaeology. So they're kind of hurting a lot of the people that could be the face of so much promotion and advertisement of these ancient sites. And when they're being funded, the university doesn't necessarily have to tailor the findings and the publishings to the likings of Graham Hancock, but at least they'll have some funding, and at least we'll all know more. And even Graham said that he could do nothing that he's done without the immense amount of work that's come from archaeology. So I just hope that people see the potential benefit and the publicity that can come from working together. But I don't know. I'm optimistic. It might not ever happen. It might just continually get worse from here, and it'll be as if this debate never really happened. I have no idea. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What do you think of the latter half, the Egyptian segment of this debate? How did you think that Graham came out? How did you think that Flint came out? Did you think that there was a winner? Do you care if there was a winner? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you'd like more videos on ancient lost civilizations, ancient mysteries, lost technology, videos of me traveling and exploring the ruins of ancient temples in the jungle, well then please like and subscribe for more, as that's really all you have to do to help out the channel. And I'm hoping to get this channel to a point where I can do this full time and I'm putting out 4 or 5 times the amount of videos. I have so much on my plate that I want to get done, and I can't do it without your help. So I'm Luke Caverns. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.